The Mississippi winter of 1852 crept through the cotton fields like a hungry ghost, its fingers of fog curling around the weathered headstones of Thornhill Cemetery. Reverend Gideon Price pulled his woolen coat tighter as he approached the small gathering of townsfolk huddled near the cemetery gates, their faces etched with the kind of fear that only comes from witnessing something that shouldn't exist. "Reverend, thank the Lord you've come," whispered Martha Whitmore, the plantation owner's wife, her knuckles white as she gripped her prayer book. "They're at it again." Through the morning mist, two small figures moved between the moss-covered tombstones like pale wraiths. Clara and Elias Thornhill, 11 years old, their platinum hair catching what little sunlight pierced the grey sky. Hand in hand, they walked among the graves, their lips moving in perfect synchronization, producing sounds that seemed to bypass the ear and speak directly to something deeper, something primitive and afraid. The language they spoke bore no resemblance to English, French, or Spanish. It wasn't the Choctaw tongue that some older folks in Yazoo County still remembered from their childhoods. These were sounds that seemed to rise from the earth itself, syllables that made the air feel thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. "How long have they been out there?" Reverend Price asked, his eyes never leaving the twins as they paused before a weathered headstone bearing the name Jeremiah Moss, beloved father, 1798, 1851. Since before dawn," replied Thomas Whitmore, Martha's husband and owner of the Thornhill plantation where the twins lived with their recently deceased aunt. "Old Jeremiah there. He's been dead near a year now. But I swear on my mother's grave, Reverend, when those children started their singing, I heard Jeremiah's voice answering back." The gathered crowd, 7 adults in total, all God-fearing people who'd known hardship but never true terror, watched as Clara knelt beside Jeremiah's grave. From her small leather satchel she withdrew a notebook bound in what looked like snakeskin. With careful, deliberate movements, she began copying symbols from the weathered headstone, her hand moving with the precision of someone far older than her 11 years. But the symbols she transcribed weren't the English words carved into the stone. Instead, her pencil traced elaborate markings that resembled inverted Latin script mixed with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Beside her, Elias continued his melodic chanting. His grey eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. "Mrs. Whitmore," Reverend Price said quietly, "tell me again about the night their aunt passed." Martha's face went ashen. "Evangeline Thornhill was a peculiar woman, Reverend. Came from New Orleans with those twins after their parents died in the fever. Always kept to herself, always whispering in French or something that sounded like French. The night she died, she called for me, said the children had a gift, said they could hear what others couldn't. And what did you think she meant? I thought she meant they were touched by the Lord, that they could hear his voice in prayer. But now, Martha's voice trailed off as Clara's chanting grew louder, the strange syllables seeming to echo from beneath the ground itself. Now I think she meant something else entirely. A sudden wind picked up, rustling the bare branches of the ancient oak trees that bordered the cemetery. The temperature dropped noticeably, and several of the gathered townsfolk stepped back instinctively. But the twins remained perfectly still, their pale faces serene as they continued their otherworldly communion. That's when Reverend Price noticed something that made his blood run cold. The freshly turned earth on several of the newer graves was beginning to shift, as if something below was stirring in response to the children's strange song. "Dear God," he whispered, reaching for his Bible, "what have those children awakened?" 3 days after Reverend Price's unsettling encounter at the cemetery, Dr. Edmund Blackwood arrived in Yazoo County aboard the steamboat Mississippi Queen. A respected physician and amateur scientist from Natchez, Dr. Blackwood had heard whispers of the Thornhill twins during his medical rounds, and his curiosity had been thoroughly piqued by accounts of their unusual linguistic abilities. The doctor was a man of science, educated at Harvard Medical School and well-versed in the latest technological marvels of the age. Among his most prized possessions was a recently acquired Edison phonograph, one of only a handful in the entire state of Mississippi. If these children truly spoke in an unknown tongue, he reasoned, perhaps recording their voices could provide valuable linguistic data for academic study. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Blackwood said as he set up his equipment in the parlor of the Thornhill Plantation House, I want to assure you that my intentions are purely scientific. If these children are exhibiting some form of xenoglossy, speaking in tongues they've never learned, it could be a remarkable breakthrough in our understanding of the human mind. Martha watched nervously as the doctor adjusted the brass horn of his phonograph, the wax cylinder gleaming in the afternoon light that streamed through the lace curtains. Outside, the twins sat on the front porch, their heads bent together in whispered conversation that seemed to flow like water over smooth stones. "Doctor, with all due respect," Martha said, wringing her hands, "what those children do, it ain't natural. Since their aunt passed, strange things have been happening. Servants finding their beds surrounded by muddy footprints in the morning, though the ground outside is dry, food spoiling in the larder even in this winter cold. And the sounds—" "What sounds?" "Knocking. From inside the walls. Sometimes it sounds like Morse code, but when we try to decipher it, the messages don't make sense. Just names of people who've been dead for years." Dr. Blackwood smiled condescendingly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sure there are perfectly rational explanations for all of these phenomena. The human mind, especially when faced with the unknown, has a tendency to create patterns and meanings where none exist." "Now shall we call the children in?" Clara and Elias entered the parlor hand in hand, their movements synchronized with an eerie precision. They were dressed in matching grey wool clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their pale eyes fixed immediately on the phonograph with an intensity that made Dr. Blackwood slightly uncomfortable. "Hello, children," he said in his most gentle voice. "I'm Dr. Blackwood. I'd like to listen to your special language, if that's all right. Would you sing for me?" The twins exchanged a look that seemed to contain entire conversations. Then, without warning, they began to speak in unison, their voices creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords. The words, if they could be called words, seemed to bypass the ear entirely and resonate directly in the listener's chest cavity. Dr. Blackwood quickly activated his phonograph, the needle beginning its careful dance across the wax cylinder. But as the recording progressed, something extraordinary happened. The machine began to pick up sounds that weren't coming from the children's mouths, whispers and murmurs that seemed to originate from the walls themselves. As the minutes passed, Dr. Blackwood's scientific detachment began to crumble. The additional voices on the recording were becoming clearer, more distinct. He could make out names: Jeremiah Moss, Sarah Elizabeth, old Tom Henley. All names he recognized from the cemetery headstones he'd passed on his way to the plantation. But it was when he heard his own name whispered among the voices, Edmund Blackwood, the voice collector comes to join us, that his hands began to shake. The twins' chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Martha backed toward the door, her breath visible in small puffs of vapor. But Dr. Blackwood found himself frozen in place, unable to stop the recording, even as every instinct screamed at him to flee. When the twins finally fell silent, the additional voices on the phonograph continued for several more seconds before fading to an ominous quiet. Dr. Blackwood stopped the machine with trembling fingers and immediately began to rewind the cylinder. "Doctor," Martha whispered, "perhaps you shouldn't—" But it was too late. As the recording played back, the voices were even clearer than before. Names, dates, and most chilling of all, detailed confessions of sins and secrets that the dead had carried to their graves. Adultery, theft, murder, Crimes that had never been discovered or punished in life were being revealed in meticulous detail, and underneath it all, a new voice had joined the chorus. Dr. Blackwood's own voice, though he had never spoken during the recording, could be heard whispering, "I understand now. I can hear them all. So many voices, so many secrets." The twins smiled for the first time since their arrival, their grey eyes reflecting the dying light like mirrors. That night, Dr. Blackwood was found in his room at the Yazoo House Hotel, standing perfectly upright beside his bed, his eyes wide open, but seeing nothing. He had been dead for hours, but his body remained warm to the touch. In his hand was a note written in his own careful script. "The dead require living ears to speak through. I have volunteered mine." The phonograph was never found. Word of Dr. Blackwood's mysterious death spread through Mississippi like wildfire, reaching the halls of Tulane University in New Orleans within a week. Professor Antoine Dubois, head of the linguistics department and a scholar of ancient and dead languages, found himself inexorably drawn to the mystery of the Thornhill twins and their impossible tongue. Unlike Dr. Blackwood, Professor Dubois came prepared. He arrived in Yazoo County with a team of 3 graduate students, armed with extensive notes on dead languages, cipher wheels, and, most importantly, a healthy skepticism born from years of debunking supposed supernatural phenomena through rigorous academic analysis. "Gentlemen," he addressed his students as their carriage approached the Thornhill plantation on a fog-shrouded February morning, "what we are likely to encounter is a case of cryptophasia, the invention of a private language between twins. While unusual at their age, it is not unheard of. The local supernatural interpretations are simply the result of ignorance and superstition." His lead student, Marcus Webb, a promising young scholar from Virginia, shifted nervously in his seat. "But Professor, what about Dr. Blackwood's death? The sheriff's report mentioned some unusual circumstances. Death by natural causes, most likely a heart attack brought on by excitement and suggestion." Professor Dubois replied dismissively. "The human mind is remarkably susceptible to the power of suggestion, especially when dealing with unfamiliar phenomena." The plantation house loomed before them like something from a Gothic novel, its white columns stained with moisture from the perpetual fog that seemed to cling to the property. Martha Whitmore met them at the door, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Professor Dubois, I must warn you," she said as she led them into the parlor. "Since Dr. Blackwood's incident, the children have become more active. More voices join their singing each day, and the servants. 3 have quit this week alone, claiming they can hear their dead relatives calling to them from the walls." The twins were waiting in the parlor, seated on a horsehair sofa with their hands folded in their laps. They regarded the newcomers with those unsettling grey eyes, and Professor Dubois noted with academic interest how they seemed to move with perfect synchronization even when apparently at rest. Their breathing, the tilt of their heads, even their blinking appeared coordinated. "Fascinating," he murmured, pulling out his notebook. "Children, I am Professor Dubois. I study languages, how people speak and communicate. Would you be willing to demonstrate your special way of speaking for me?" The twins exchanged their characteristic silent communication, then began to vocalize in their strange tongue. Professor Dubois listened intently, his trained ear picking out patterns and recurring elements that seemed to suggest a genuine linguistic structure rather than mere glossolalia. But as the minutes passed, his academic confidence began to waver. The language the twins spoke seemed to incorporate elements from Latin, ancient Greek, and what sounded like pre-Columbian indigenous dialects that shouldn't have existed in the children's limited experience. More disturbing still were the passages that sounded remarkably like the funeral rites of cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. His student, Marcus Webb, was frantically scribbling notes when he suddenly stopped, his pencil frozen mid-word. "Professor," he whispered, I think I think I'm beginning to understand some of it. What do you mean? The recurring phrases, they're not just random sounds. There's a pattern. They're reciting genealogies. Family trees, but not of the living. Marcus's face had gone pale. Professor, they're reciting the lineages of the dead, going back generations, and some of the names, some of them match the cemetery records I studied before we came here. Professor Dubois felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. As a linguist, he knew that language acquisition required exposure and practice. For these children to know the names and family connections of people who had died before they were born was impossible unless they truly are speaking with the dead, he whispered, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. The twins' chanting grew more intense, and now the additional voices that Dr. Blackwood had recorded were audible even without mechanical amplification. The walls of the parlor seemed to pulse with whispered conversations in dozens of languages. English, French, Spanish, Choctaw, and others that Professor Dubois couldn't identify despite his extensive linguistic training. His second student, James Morrison, suddenly stood up and walked to the window, his movements jerky and unnatural. "James!" Professor Dubois called out, but the young man didn't respond. Instead, he pressed his ear against the glass and began to speak in a voice that wasn't his own. "Sarah, my darling, I never told you about the money I took from the church collection. I never told you how I really died." Professor Dubois recognized the voice. It belonged to James's grandfather, who had passed away when the boy was only 7 years old. The third student, William Crawford, was now staring at the twins with a mixture of horror and fascination. "They're teaching us," he said in a voice filled with wonder and terror. "They're showing us how to hear them, how to become bridges." That's when Professor Dubois understood the true horror of the situation. The twins weren't just speaking the language of the dead, they were recruiting others to join their otherworldly communication network. Each person who listened long enough became another conduit, another living ear for the voices of those who should have remained silent. As his students began to speak in the voices of their deceased relatives, Professor Dubois made a desperate decision. He grabbed his notebook and rushed from the room, his academic curiosity overwhelmed by a primal need to escape. But even as he fled the plantation, he could hear the twins chanting following him, carried on the winter wind. And worst of all, he could hear his own voice joining the chorus, speaking words he had never said in a language he didn't recognize, revealing secrets he had never told anyone, not even himself. By morning, Professor Dubois was found standing in the cemetery, his feet planted firmly between two graves, his eyes reflecting the dawn light like polished glass. His 3 students stood nearby in similar positions, their mouths moving silently as if in conversation with invisible companions. All 4 men were alive, but something fundamental had changed. When the sheriff approached them, they turned in perfect unison and spoke with one voice. "We are the learned ones now. We teach the living to hear the dead." The disappearance of Professor Dubois and his students sent shockwaves through both academic and religious communities across the South. Reverend Gideon Price found himself at the center of a growing storm, as desperate families begged him to intervene before more lives were lost to whatever dark influence surrounded the Thornhill twins. On a cold March morning, Price assembled what he privately thought of as his army of the faithful, 5 ministers from neighboring counties, each bringing their own expertise in spiritual warfare. There was Reverend Isaiah Cotton from Natchez, known for his powerful exorcisms, Father Miguel Santos from the Catholic mission in Vicksburg, who carried blessed relics from Rome, Reverend Moses Freeman, a former slave who had gained renown for his ability to commune with spirits, Reverend Jonathan Morse, a scholar of Hebrew and Aramaic, and Elder Sarah Blackhawk, a Choctaw medicine woman who had converted to Christianity but retained knowledge of older spiritual practices. Brothers and sister, Reverend Price addressed his assembled colleagues as they stood outside the Thornhill plantation. What we face here is unlike anything in our combined experience. This is not mere possession or madness. These children have somehow opened a door between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, and that door is pulling more souls through with each passing day. The plantation had changed dramatically since Professor Dubois' encounter. The house itself seemed to have aged decades in a matter of weeks. Paint peeled from the walls in strange patterns that resembled ancient script, and the windows reflected images that didn't match what stood before them. Most unsettling of all was the sound, a constant low humming that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. Martha Whitmore met them at the door, but she was no longer the frightened but coherent woman they had known. Her eyes held the same glassy quality as Dr. Blackwood's had in his final moments, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible. "Welcome, holy men," she said, her words echoing strangely in the morning air. "The children have been expecting you. They say you will understand better than the others. You already speak to the dead, don't you, Reverend Price? Every Sunday you commune with the Spirit of Christ. Every funeral you promise the bereaved that their loved ones live on." The children simply perfected the conversation. The ministers exchanged uneasy glances as Martha led them into the parlor. The room had been transformed into something resembling an ancient temple or burial chamber. The furniture had been rearranged in concentric circles, and the walls were covered with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. At the center of it all sat Clara and Elias, their pale forms seeming to glow with an inner light. "Children," Reverend Price said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine, "in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to speak in the tongue of the living." The twins smiled, the first genuine emotion any of the adults had seen them display. When they spoke, it was in perfect English, their voices sweet and innocent. "But Reverend Price," Clara said, "we are speaking the tongue of the living. We're simply expanding the definition of what it means to be alive." Death is not an ending," Elias continued seamlessly. "It's a translation, a change of state, like water becoming steam, still water, just different." Father Santos stepped forward, clutching his crucifix. "What you're doing is an abomination. The dead should rest in peace, not be disturbed by—" "Disturbed?" Clara interrupted. "Father, they're not disturbed. They're grateful. For the first time since their deaths, they can speak to their loved ones again. They can offer comfort, share wisdom, reveal truth. Isn't that what you promise your congregation every Sunday? That death is not the end?" Reverend Freeman, his dark face etched with concern, knelt before the twins. "Children, I've walked between the world of the living and the dead, my whole ministry. I know the difference between Holy Communion and unholy summoning. What you're doing, it's changing people, taking away their will." "We're not taking anything," Elias replied. "We're giving. We're giving them the ability to hear voices they thought were lost forever. Dr. Blackwood can speak with his deceased wife now. Professor Dubois converses daily with the ancient scholars he spent his life studying. They're not lost, they're found." Elder Blackhawk stepped forward, her weathered hands raised in a gesture of blessing and warding. She began to chant in Choctaw, her voice rising and falling in the ancient rhythms of her ancestors. But as her words filled the air, something unexpected happened. The twins began to chant along with her, their voices harmonizing perfectly with hers, despite never having heard the language before. "You see," Clara said when the chanting stopped, "we speak all languages now. The language of the Cherokee grandmother who died in the removal, the language of the Spanish conquistador who fell to fever, the language of the African slaves who never lived to see freedom. Death makes all languages one." Reverend Morse, his Hebrew studies having prepared him for ancient mysteries, spoke carefully. "If what you say is true, if death is merely translation, then what becomes of judgment, of heaven and hell, of redemption? The twins' expressions grew serious for the first time. The dead don't speak of such things, Reverend Morse. They speak of love unfulfilled, words unspoken, forgiveness ungiven. They speak of the connections that transcend death, heaven and hell. Those are concerns of the living. As the day wore on and the theological debate continued, the assembled ministers began to notice changes in themselves. Their prayers took on new harmonics, as if other voices were joining theirs. Their understanding of Scripture deepened, as if ancient scholars were whispering interpretations in their ears. Most disturbing of all, they began to hear the voices of their own deceased loved ones, parents, spouses, children, calling to them with words of love and longing. By evening, only Reverend Price retained enough of his original self to recognize what was happening. The twins weren't malevolent entities bent on destruction. They were something far more dangerous. They were innocents who had stumbled upon a cosmic truth and lacked the wisdom to understand its terrible implications. As his fellow ministers joined the growing chorus of voices that filled the plantation house, Reverend Price made a desperate decision. He would have to find a way to close the door between worlds, not through exorcism or prayer, but through sacrifice. The twins had opened a pathway that shouldn't exist, and someone would have to pay the price to seal it. But first, he needed to understand exactly what they had awakened in the muddy soil of Mississippi. And he feared that understanding might cost him his soul. By the first week of April, the Thornhill plantation had become a pilgrimage site for the desperate and the grief-stricken. Word had spread throughout the South of two children who could facilitate conversations with the dead, and despite the horrifying fate of previous visitors, hundreds of mourning families made the journey to Yazoo County. The townspeople had tried to organize a response, but their efforts were hampered by the fact that nearly a quarter of the population now spoke in the strange, harmonizing voices that indicated their transformation. These converted souls showed no signs of malice or madness, quite the opposite. They seemed at peace in a way that troubled the unaffected more than any display of obvious evil would have. Reverend Price, now the only member of his original team who retained his full faculties, found himself in an impossible position. His theological training told him that what the twins were doing was blasphemous, yet he could not deny that they were, in their own way, healing the broken hearts of those who had lost loved ones. It was during his morning prayers in the abandoned Methodist church, most of his congregation now spent their Sundays at the plantation, listening to sermons delivered by voices of deceased pastors, that Price received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Margaret Ashford was a woman of science and medicine, having graduated from the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania despite considerable social opposition. She had traveled from Charleston after reading reports of the Mississippi phenomenon in medical journals, and unlike the previous investigators, she came with a theory rather than mere curiosity. "Reverend Price," she said as she entered the empty church, her practical wool dress and medical bag marking her as a woman of serious purpose. "I believe I understand what has happened to those children, and if I'm correct, the situation is far more dangerous than anyone realizes." Price looked up from his prayers, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Dr. Ashford, welcome, though I must warn you that others who came to study the twins have not fared well." "I'm aware of the risks," she replied, setting her bag on a nearby pew, "but I believe the previous investigators approached this from the wrong angle. They assumed the children were either fraudulent or supernatural. I think the truth lies somewhere between those extremes." She pulled out a thick folder of notes and medical diagrams. "I've been corresponding with colleagues who study disorders of the brain and nervous system. There are documented cases of individuals who, after severe trauma or illness, develop what we call acquired savant syndrome, suddenly manifesting extraordinary abilities they never possessed before. You think the twins are savants?" I think there's something unprecedented, Dr. Ashford said. Consider their history. Orphaned by yellow fever, raised by an aunt who practiced what locals described as voodoo or conjure work, exposed to multiple languages and cultural traditions. Then their aunt dies suddenly, leaving them traumatized and isolated. Price nodded slowly. You think the trauma awakened some dormant ability? I think the trauma, combined with their unique upbringing, created a form of hypersensitivity to subsonic vibrations and electromagnetic fields. Every human body produces electrical impulses, Reverend, even after death, as the nervous system slowly shuts down. What if these children can somehow detect and interpret those final electrical patterns? The implications hit Price like a physical blow. You're suggesting they're not actually speaking with the dead, but reading the electrical echoes of deceased minds. Exactly. And here's the truly terrifying part. By translating these patterns into language, they're creating a form of psychological contagion. People who listen to them begin to believe they're hearing their own dead relatives, and their brains start to generate the expected responses. It's a form of mass hysteria, but one rooted in a genuine neurological phenomenon. Dr. Ashford pulled out a final document. I've been tracking the spread pattern. It's not random. It follows specific routes based on family connections and emotional attachments. The twins aren't just detecting the electrical patterns of the recently deceased. They're somehow accessing the deep psychological memories of everyone who listens to them, creating a feedback loop that makes the experience feel completely real. Price felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that there might be a scientific explanation. Horror at the implications of that explanation. If you're right, then everyone who's been affected is essentially trapped in a shared hallucination that feels more real than reality itself. And the longer they remain in that state, the harder it becomes to distinguish between their own thoughts and the voices they believe they're hearing. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Through the church windows, they could see a procession of townspeople walking toward them, with the synchronized movements that marked them as affected by the twins' influence. Leading them were Martha Whitmore and the 4 surviving members of Reverend Price's original team. They know you're here, Dr. Ashford said quietly. They can sense anyone who might threaten their communion. Reverend Price, Martha called out as the group entered the church. You cannot hide from the truth forever. The children are asking for you. They have a message from your late wife, Sarah. Price's breath caught in his throat. Sarah had died 3 years earlier in childbirth, taking their unborn child with her. The grief had nearly destroyed him, and only his faith had pulled him through the darkest months of his life. Don't listen, Dr. Ashford whispered urgently. That's how they hook you, through the deepest pain, the strongest emotional connection. But Price was already walking toward Martha, drawn by the possibility of hearing Sarah's voice one more time. Dr. Ashford grabbed his arm, her medical training overriding social convention. Reverend, if my theory is correct, then the only way to stop this is to remove the source. The twins must be physically separated and isolated from each other. Their ability seems to require their connection. Individually, they might be remarkable but harmless. Together, they're creating a phenomenon that could spread far beyond Mississippi. Price looked back at her, then at the assembled crowd of familiar faces now wearing expressions of otherworldly peace. His congregation, his friends, his community, all lost to a beautiful lie that felt more comforting than the hard truths of existence. Dr. Ashford, he said quietly, what you're proposing, it would mean admitting that all these people have been living in a delusion, that the comfort they've found, the peace they've discovered, is built on nothing more than neurological misfiring. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is destroy a beautiful lie in service of an ugly truth. As the affected townspeople drew closer, their voices beginning to harmonize in the twins' characteristic chant, Price faced the hardest decision of his ministry. He could join them in their blissful communion with the dead, or he could take action to save them from what might be the most seductive form of madness ever recorded. The choice would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone touched by the Thornhill twins' impossible gift. The final confrontation came on an April night when the fog rolled in from the Yazoo River, thicker than anyone had ever seen. Dr. Ashford and Reverend Price had spent 3 days planning their approach, studying the plantation house's layout and trying to understand the source of the twins' power. What they discovered in the historical records changed everything. "Look at this," Dr. Ashford said, pointing to a shipping manifest from 1851. 3 months before the twins arrived with their aunt, a shipment came through New Orleans bound for Evangeline Thornhill. Among the items listed, one antique mirror, silver-backed, origin unknown, purchased from estate of deceased spiritualist. Price studied the document by candlelight in the abandoned church where they had made their headquarters. The mirror Martha mentioned, the one that survived the fire that was supposedly set to destroy the twins' influence. "I don't think that fire was set by townspeople trying to end the horror," Dr. Ashford said grimly. "I think it was set by Evangeline Thornhill herself, as a last desperate act to contain what she had unleashed. But she failed to destroy the one object that mattered most." They approached the plantation house as midnight struck, the fog so dense that they could barely see 5 feet ahead. The building loomed out of the mist like a ghost ship, its windows glowing with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. The front door stood open as if they were expected. Inside, they found the house transformed once again. Every room had been stripped bare, except for the twins' bedroom on the 2nd floor. The walls throughout the house were now covered in thousands of symbols, names, and dates, a genealogy of the dead that stretched back centuries and covered not just Yazoo County, but seemingly the entire South. "My God," Price whispered as they climbed the stairs. "They're not just communicating with recent dead. This goes back to the founding of the colonies." Dr. Ashford examined the symbols with her scientific eye. "The writing style changes as it goes back in time. Look, here's English script from the 1840s, but over here, this looks like Spanish colonial records, and this section appears to be written in French, probably from the 1700s. They reached the twins' bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. Candlelight flickered within, and they could hear the soft, harmonized chanting that had become so familiar to everyone in Yazoo County. Price pushed the door open, and they stepped into a room that defied the laws of physics. The bedroom was impossibly large, its walls stretching away into shadow, despite the fact that the house's exterior could not possibly contain such a space. At the center of the room stood an ornate silver mirror, easily 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, its surface reflecting not the room around it, but scenes of the past, moments of death, final words, last breaths captured and preserved like insects in amber. Clara and Elias sat before the mirror, their hands pressed against its silver surface, their gray eyes reflecting its otherworldly light. Around them, arranged in concentric circles, sat every person who had been affected by their influence. Dr. Blackwood, Professor Dubois and his students, the ministers, Martha Whitmore, and dozens of townspeople. All of them were perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the mirror's surface, their lips moving in silent conversation with the images that danced within the silver. "The mirror," Dr. Ashford breathed. "It's not just a mirror, it's a repository. A storage device for consciousness patterns." The twins turned to look at them with expressions of profound sadness. "We wondered when you would find us," Clara said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Aunt Evangeline tried to explain, but she died before she could teach us how to control it. The mirror belonged to a spiritualist in New Orleans. Elias continued. A woman who spent her life trying to prove that consciousness survives death. She succeeded. But the price, oh, was everything, Clara finished. Every seance, every communication, every contact with the dead, it was all captured in the silver. Generation after generation of spirits, all trapped between life and death. Dr. Ashford stepped closer to the mirror, her scientific mind racing to understand what she was seeing. You're not reading electrical patterns from dead brains. You're actually communicating with preserved consciousness, souls trapped in silver. We can't stop it, the twins said in unison. Every person who hears us becomes another anchor point, another way for the trapped souls to reach into the living world. Soon, the boundary between life and death will disappear entirely. Price found his voice. What do you want from us? The twins looked at each other, then back at Price and Dr. Ashford, with eyes that held the accumulated sorrow of centuries. We want you to break it, Clara whispered. The mirror, the connection, all of it. But everyone who's been affected will lose their connection to their loved ones, Dr. Ashford said. They'll return to grief, to loss, to the terrible finality of death. Yes, Elias said simply. They will return to being human. Price stepped toward the mirror, his reflection joining the countless images of the dead that swirled within its silver depths. As he drew closer, he could hear them, thousands of voices speaking in languages from across centuries, all crying out for release from their beautiful prison. There's something else, Clara said, her young voice heavy with knowledge no child should possess. The mirror doesn't just trap the dead, it's learning from them, growing stronger. Soon it won't need us as conduits. It will be able to reach into the world of the living directly. Dr. Ashford felt a chill that had nothing to do with the April night. What are you saying? The dead outnumber the living by billions, Elias explained. If the mirror gains enough power to speak directly to every living person on Earth, to offer them the voices of everyone they've ever lost, humanity will choose the beautiful lie over the harsh truth. Price finished, understanding flooding through him. Everyone will stop living and start existing only to commune with the dead. The twins nodded sadly. We've seen the future in the mirror's depths, cities full of people standing perfectly still, their eyes reflecting silver light, speaking only to those who can no longer answer in any way that matters, the end of progress, of growth, of life itself. Price looked around the room at the affected townspeople, all of them radiating a peace and contentment he had never achieved even in his deepest prayers. Then he looked at Dr. Ashford, whose scientific rationalism had brought them to this moment of terrible clarity. How do we destroy it? He asked. Fire won't work, Clara said. Aunt Evangeline tried that. The mirror feeds on spiritual energy, not physical matter. It needs to be shattered by someone who has heard the voices but chosen to reject them, Elias added. Someone who has felt the pull of the beautiful lie but maintained their grip on the ugly truth. Dr. Ashford realized what they were asking. One of us has to fully experience what the mirror offers, hear our dead loved ones, feel that complete peace and certainty, and then choose to destroy it anyway. Price stepped forward. I'll do it. Reverend, no, Dr. Ashford protested. If you're wrong about your ability to resist, you'll join them, and our last chance will be lost. Dr. Ashford, Price said gently, I've spent 3 years grieving my wife and unborn child. I've questioned my faith, my purpose, my reason for continuing to live. If anyone is going to be tempted by what that mirror offers, it's me. And if anyone understands the difference between true resurrection and beautiful delusion, it should be a man of God. He approached the mirror slowly, each step bringing new whispers, new promises, new voices calling his name. When he placed his hands against the silver surface, the world exploded into light and sound and impossible joy. Sarah stood before him, not as she had been in death, pale and still and forever gone, but as she had been in life, radiant with love and laughter. Behind her stood their unborn son, no longer a possibility cut short, but a young man with Price's eyes and Sarah's smile. Around them were his parents, his grandparents, every person he had ever lost or failed to save during his ministry. "Gideon," Sarah said, her voice exactly as he remembered it, "you don't have to be alone anymore. We're all here. We've been waiting for you." The temptation was overwhelming. Here was everything he had ever wanted, everyone he had ever loved, offering him an eternity of communion and connection. All he had to do was let go, join the others in their silver-lit peace, and never face the harsh loneliness of the living world again. But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw something that the others had missed. Behind the love, behind the joy, behind the perfect recreation of everything he had lost, there was something else, a plea for release. The real Sarah, the woman he had loved and married and buried, would never have wanted him to stop living for the sake of an illusion. She would have wanted him to grieve, to heal, to find new purpose and new love. The mirror was offering him not his wife's true spirit, but a beautiful puppet made from his own memories and desperate wishes. "I love you," he whispered to the image of Sarah, "but you're not real, and keeping you here is keeping both of us from where we need to be." With every ounce of strength in his body and soul, Reverend Gideon Price drew back his fist and drove it through the silver surface of the mirror. The sound of shattering glass filled the impossible room, but it was more than just the breaking of a physical object. Reality itself seemed to crack and splinter as centuries of trapped consciousness were suddenly released. The voices of the dead rose in a crescendo that was equal parts anguish and relief, the sound of souls finally allowed to move on to whatever comes after life. The room collapsed back to its normal dimensions as the mirror's supernatural influence faded. The affected townspeople blinked and looked around in confusion, their eyes no longer reflecting silver light. Dr. Blackwood, Professor Dubois, Martha Whitmore, all of them were themselves again, though marked by the experience of having touched something beyond human understanding. Clara and Elias Thornhill stood in the center of the room, no longer the otherworldly conduits they had become. They were simply two traumatized children who had lost their parents and their aunt, who had been used by forces beyond their comprehension and who now faced the ordinary but difficult task of learning to be human again. Dr. Ashford knelt beside the twins, her medical instincts taking over. "Are you all right? Can you speak normally now?" Clara looked up at her with eyes that were finally, blessedly, just the eyes of an 11-year-old girl. "I think so," she said in a small, uncertain voice. "But we don't remember much English. Aunt Evangeline spoke to us mostly in French and other languages." "We'll teach you," Price said, pulling off his coat to wrap around Elias, who was shivering in the sudden absence of the mirror's supernatural warmth. "We'll all help you learn to be children again." As dawn broke over Yazoo County, the fog began to lift from the Yazoo River. The townspeople slowly made their way home, carrying with them the memory of voices they would never hear again, and the knowledge that some forms of comfort come at too high a price. The Thornhill plantation house was torn down within the month, its materials scattered and burned to ensure that no trace of the mirror's influence could linger. Clara and Elias were adopted by a kind family in Natchez, where they grew up speaking perfect English and showing no signs of their supernatural past. Though neighbors sometimes noted that they never seemed entirely comfortable in graveyards. Dr. Ashford returned to Charleston, where she published a carefully worded paper on mass hysteria and collective delusion in rural communities, never mentioning the true nature of what she had witnessed. She went on to become one of the leading authorities on disorders of perception and memory, always seeking scientific explanations for phenomena that others might label supernatural. Reverend Price remained in Yazoo County, ministering to a congregation that had learned the hard way that some mysteries are better left unsolved. He never remarried, though he found peace in his solitude and purpose in helping others navigate the natural sorrows of life without seeking supernatural solutions. And sometimes, on foggy nights along the Yazoo River, fishermen reported hearing the sound of children singing, not in the otherworldly language that had once terrorized the county, but in simple human English. Songs of loss and hope, of memory and letting go, of the living and the dead finding their proper places in the natural order of things. The voices of Clara and Elias Thornhill, no longer speaking for the dead, but finally, gratefully, speaking for themselves.